The rain didn't fall. It attacked, fierce and punishing. It wasn't the kind that nourished dry land or cooled a summer day. It slapped down hard, rattling rooftops and soaking coats clean through. A rain that made the air smell like old mistakes and mule sweat. Jedediah Tate hunched in the saddle, collar turned up, jaw locked tight. The path to Tanner's Ridge had turned into a mire of thick mud and bad memories. Crow, his old gelding, groaned under the weight of man and storm. But Jedediah pressed on. He had no choice. Not when a man was riding this close to his own ghost. It had been more than a year since he'd come this way. Too much history knotted in these woods, especially when the wind shifted just right, and carried a whisper that sounded too much like, "Papa." 2 days ago, a note had appeared, scribbled in ink faded and smudged, slipped under his door like a secret trying not to be seen. Got a stallion worth your coin. Good legs. Fast. Signed, Tor. Tanner's Ridge. He'd nearly tossed it into the fire. But something about the name Jeb pulled at him, the way old injuries ache when a storm's rolling in. And so he came, soaked to the bone, boots fighting the mud, heart hammering like it did that night she didn't come home. He spotted the barn before he saw the house, a crooked, sagging structure that had known better decades. A lantern swung weakly on a rusted hook by the door, its light barely holding on. No smoke from the chimney, no sound but the steady hiss of rain, and the groan of Crow's saddle. A figure stepped from the shadows, thin, hunched, worn well past his years. Maybe 40, but life had chewed him up like 70. Grease smeared his shirt, and one eye was clouded like milk. He squinted at Jedediah, forcing a smile that didn't belong on any face. "You Tate." Jedediah didn't answer with words. He just swung off Crow and tied the reins to the post. "You Jeb. That's what they call me. Show me the horse." Jeb hesitated, not long, just long enough to leave a mark. "Back stall," he said, motioning with his chin. The barn groaned as they stepped inside. A stank of damp straw, rusted iron, and something underneath it all, something sour and sharp, like rotting truth. Jedediah let his eyes adjust to the dark. A line of stalls stretched out, most of them empty, except one. Something moved in the last one, a dark form shifting low. "That the horse?" "No. Winnie, don't kick." Jedediah's brow furrowed. "You keep a horse tied down like that?" Jeb scratched absently at his neck. "He's a mean one. Don't take to strangers." "Neither do I." He stepped forward, boots thudding on old planks, senses prickling like they always did before things went sideways. The stall's door was warped and held shut with rusted iron brackets. Jedediah pushed it open, slow and cautious, then froze. It wasn't a horse. It was a girl. No, a woman. Filthy. Grown. Huddled like a wounded animal. Ropes dug into her wrists, gag tied tight around her mouth. A strip of green cloth hung from her shoulders, frayed and rain-soaked. For a moment the world held its breath. Even the storm outside seemed to go still. Jedediah couldn't move, couldn't breathe. That cloth, covered in tiny white roses. He knew it. His wife had sewn it herself, a baby shawl Lydia Grace used to wrap her dolls. "Dear God," he whispered. "Lydia Grace." She flinched at the sound. Her eyes opened slowly, blue so piercing it hurt. Tears poured out like they'd been locked away for years, just waiting for someone to give them permission. She tried to speak, but the gag strangled the sound. Jedediah moved on instinct, blade out, ropes severed, gag gone. Her lips trembled as she looked at him, like he was something out of a half-remembered dream. "Papa," she croaked. A noise ripped from his chest. Not a word, not even a cry, just pain pure and raw. Then came the unmistakable click of a gun behind him. He turned. Jeb stood 10 feet back, rifle trembling in his hands. "Didn't want it like this," he mumbled. "She was meant to be gone by nightfall." "You filthy!" Jedediah lunged. The shot rang out, missed him by inches, shattered a beam overhead. Lydia Grace screamed. Jedediah hit the dirt, rolled, and took Jeb down hard. The rifle fired again, this time into the ceiling. They grappled in the mud, fists flying. Jedediah struck like a man possessed. Grief sharpened into rage, his knuckles finding bone. Blood spattering across hay. Jeb groaned and sagged. Jedediah stood over him, chest heaving, shirt stained red. Then he turned. Lydia Grace hadn't moved. She sat frozen, knees drawn tight, arms wrapped around herself. Like the air had betrayed her. "I'm taking you home," he said, voice barely above the storm. Her lip quivered. "There ain't no home left." He dropped to his knees beside her, his voice cracking like old timber. "There will be. I swear it." Suddenly, the barn door burst open. 2 men stormed in, dripping rain and snarling like dogs. No badges. No law. Just gunmetal and menace. "Jeb said she'd be dead," one growled. "She ain't," said the other, raising his weapon. Jedediah stepped in front of her, silent and steady. "You're not taking her," he said. The taller one sneered. "And who's gonna stop us?" Jedediah didn't answer. He just drew. 2 shots cracked like thunder. Both men dropped. Smoke curled from his revolver like it was exhaling. Jedediah slowly lowered the barrel. Lydia Grace stared at him, eyes full of something he couldn't quite name. Fear. Wonder. Grief. "We gotta go," he told her. I can't walk too far," she whispered. Without a word, he scooped her into his arms, just like he did when she was small, and scraped up her knees on the gravel road. "You won't need to. Just hang on." Outside, the rain kept falling, but something in it had changed. It felt less like punishment and more like a cleansing. He swung up onto Crow with Lydia Grace cradled in his arms, her small frame wrapped snugly in his coat. Behind them, the barn smoldered. Not from flames, but from the weight of every buried truth finally set alight. They vanished into the storm, unaware of the silhouette that lingered on the ridge. A rider, still as stone, watching, waiting, following. Out here, the West doesn't hand out forgiveness, but every once in a while it gives something back. And sometimes a man rides straight through hell and comes out holding what was once lost. The storm didn't quit. It trailed them like it had a vendetta to settle. Jedediah Tate urged Crow onward, weaving through the rain-slick forest path. One hand gripped the reins, the other held tight around Lydia Grace. Her trembling body pressed close to his chest. She was his daughter, Lydia Grace, 10 years gone. Not dead like he'd feared, but stolen, hidden, kept like a ghost in that God-forsaken barn. Now she was here, shaking, soaked, alive. Since they'd fled, she hadn't said a word. Her hands clung to his shirt like she was afraid letting go would send her falling back into the dark. Her head rested against his collarbone, her wet hair plastered to her cheek. And every now and then she'd flinch it. At the snap of a twig, a gust of wind, a distant rumble of thunder. Smoke still threaded up behind them, curling faintly through the trees. He didn't know if the men back there were dead. Didn't much care either. "You're safe now," he murmured once, his voice sandpapered by smoke and silence. She didn't reply, but she didn't loosen her grip either. By the time they reached the ravine, the rain had eased into a steady, whispering drizzle. Jedediah guided Crow under a low, rocky ledge that offered just enough shelter from the elements. He climbed down first, then gently lifted Lydia Grace and lowered her onto a bed of damp pine needles. She winced as her feet touched ground. Are they broken? He asked, squatting beside her. She shook her head. Ain't used em proper in a long time. He gave a short nod, jaw set tight. I'll get a fire going. No, she said faintly, barely above her breath. They'll spot the smoke. Her eyes searched the darkness. They always do. He paused, then tossed the tinder aside without a word. Instead, he pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders and eased her against a flat slab of stone. Her eyes wouldn't stop scanning the shadows. One hand kept drifting to her wrist, fingertips brushing the raw, red marks left by rope. Jedediah sat a short distance away, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. Neither of them said anything for a long while. At last, her voice broke the silence. How long? She asked. How long VE you been searching? He let out a slow breath. Every single day. She turned her head toward him, her eyes hollow and tired. What about Mama? He swallowed hard. She passed. Fever. 6 winters ago. She nodded like she already knew, but her lip trembled anyway. I used to dream she'd come, or that you would. I should've, he said, voice cracking under the weight. I should have found you. You couldn't, she whispered. They never let me stay put. Always changing names, moving towns. They said if I ever tried to run, they'd kill whoever came for me. He clenched his jaw. I still should have tried harder. She turned to look at him. But you came now. The wind shifted again. A branch snapped in the distance. Jedediah was on his feet instantly, revolver in hand. Lydia Grace froze. They're still hunting, she said. I know their ways. That bastard Jeb? He was just a pawn, she continued. There's someone bigger behind all this. A man with a red bandana. Always wore it proud, like it meant something. Jedediah's brow furrowed. You catch his name? No, but I'll never forget his eyes. She pulled her knees to her chest, voice growing quieter. They treated us like property, said we were broken, worthless. Her voice cracked, and I believed him. For a long time. You're not broken, Jedediah said, his tone steady but soft. She didn't respond. By the time darkness settled, the clouds had pulled back enough to reveal a stretch of stars. Jedediah finally risked a fire, small, low, fed with damp needles. Just enough to warm her fingers. She didn't ask for food. She hadn't eaten a bite since he'd pulled her from that stall. And that's when he heard it. A horse's whinny. Faint, but close. Too close. He stamped out the flame, covering the embers with dirt. We ride, he said, already lifting her to her feet. She tried to stand, but her knees gave out. I can't. You can, he snapped, then gentled. Just lean on me. Crow pawed the ground nervously as they mounted. Jedediah steadied Lydia Grace once more, holding her close. I'm not letting them take you. Not this time. They tore through the brush at speed, branches ripping at their coats, roots clawing at Crow's hooves. But Jedediah knew this land. He'd hunted these woods years ago. He remembered where the stream bent south, and how the old mining trail curled west toward an abandoned cabin. He took the long way around. No torchlight behind them yet. An hour later they arrived. The cabin was barely standing. Roof half collapsed, beams choked with moss, the front door hanging crooked on one hinge. But it would have to do. Inside, the air was stale and dry. Jedediah struck a stub of candle and set it flickering. Then he carried Lydia Grace to a creaking bed frame and laid her down. She didn't resist, just stared up at the beams like she expected the roof to fall in. You remember this place? he asked. She shook her head. We came here once, he said. You were a little thing. Caught a firefly and told me it was a piece of the moon. Her eyes fluttered. I wanted to catch stars too. You tried, he chuckled. Nearly cracked your skull falling off the stump. A small, dry laugh slipped from her. Uncertain, but real. The first sound of lightness he'd heard from her in a decade. Jedediah moved to the window, revolver across his lap. And then he saw it, a flicker deep in the trees. Torchlight, moving slow, but getting closer. They're tracking us, Jedediah muttered under his breath. Damn hounds must have picked up the scent. He turned to Lydia Grace, voice low but firm. I need you to stay quiet, whatever happens. She met his gaze with that same wide-eyed trust he remembered from years ago. I'm not 8 anymore. No, he said gently, but you're still mine. The next 30 minutes dragged like hours. The torchlight crept closer, slow but certain. Jedediah counted at least 3 silhouettes, maybe more. He slipped out just beyond the cabin's doorway, crouching low in the dark. Pistol in hand. Breath steady. Finger ready. The first figure to break the trees was tall. Leather coat, wide-brimmed hat. Not Jeb and not the one with the red bandana. This one moved like a soldier. Jedediah waited until the man was 5 paces from the door, then squeezed the trigger. The bullet tore into the man's shoulder, spinning him with a sharp cry. Then chaos exploded. Gunshots rang out like fireworks. Jedediah dove behind an old busted barrel. Lydia Grace screamed once, then went quiet just as he'd told her. Another man charged the doorway. Jedediah fired low, catching him in the thigh. A third ducked behind a tree and returned fire. Splinters burst from the wall near Jedediah's head. You're outnumbered, old man, someone yelled. Then learn how to count, Jedediah shot back. He fired again. Another scream answered. Then silence. One of them bolted. Jedediah didn't follow. Didn't need to. No fourth man came. He stepped back inside. Lydia Grace hadn't moved, still lying there with her eyes locked on the ceiling, lips trembling. It's over, he said softly. For now. She gave a single nod, then whispered. There'll be more. There's always more. Let him come, he said flatly. No, she said, voice hollow. You don't get it. She looked up at him, face pale, haunted. The one with the red bandana, he's not just some thug. He's got half the law under his thumb from here to Silver Pass. People disappear and no one says a word. Jedediah's jaw clenched. What's his name? I told you I never heard it. But he's real. And he always finds me. The silence hung between them. Thick, heavy, full of dread. Then, almost like the words were choking her, she said, I had a child. Jedediah blinked. She sat up slowly, hands fisted in her lap. 2 years after they took me. They sold me to some man in Montana Territory. Kept me locked in a cellar. Her voice cracked. When I gave birth, they took the baby. Said it was a girl. Said she didn't deserve to live in filth. The next words nearly tore her apart. I don't know where they took her. I don't know if she's even alive. Jedediah reached out, his hand covering hers. We'll find her. Just like I found you. You don't even know where to begin. He looked out the busted window. Rain had started falling again. I always find what they try to hide. The candle on the table flickered one last time, then went out. And in that cold, ruined cabin, they sat in silence. A father and daughter. Tied not just by blood, but by every scar time refused to heal. Morning crept in with quiet force. And with it came the reckoning. Mist hung low over the hills, clinging to the ground like a secret being kept too long. The path into town wound past brittle orchards and creeks bloated by the storm. Jedediah rode with his hat pulled low, his coat wrapped around Lydia Grace, her arms clinging faintly to his waist. Since the shootout, she hadn't said much. Her voice seemed buried somewhere deeper than pain. Every step Crow took pounded harder in Jedediah's chest. It had been nearly 7 years since he last rode into Dry Fork. 7 years since the trial that never came. Since the whispers started about his misfortune, his cursed name. Until folks drifted away like morning smoke. Back then, he was just the man who'd lost his daughter. Now, he was the man who'd brought her back. The streets were slick with rain. The filth washed clean, but the past still caked in the cracks. The general store door creaked open before he even stopped. Curtains moved. A dog barked once, then went quiet again. Only the saloon stirred, its lanterns burning soft behind warped panes of glass. Jedediah dismounted in front of the old doctor's place. He helped Lydia Grace down gently. Her legs shook, but she stayed upright. Dr. Merrick opened the door just as Jedediah lifted his hand to knock. "Tate," the man said, squinting. "Well, I'll be damned." "No time," Jedediah said, brushing past him. "She needs help." Quietly, Merrick's eyes landed on Lydia Grace. He froze. "Holy hell, is that?" "Just patch her up," Jedediah said, voice firm. "We'll talk later." Inside, the air was thick with tinctures and antiseptic. Lydia Grace sat on the exam table while Merrick checked her over. Wrists, back, old burns, faded bruises. She didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She just stared at the ceiling like she was somewhere far away. Merrick finally turned to Jedediah. "She needs time. Rest. Maybe more time than you've got." "She's sick? Infections?" "Not that I see. But the damage runs deep. Real deep." Jedediah nodded, lips pressed tight. Merrick's voice dropped. "You sure it's her?" "She remembered things no one else could," Jedediah said softly. "Her laugh. That green shawl. Her eyes. She was just 8 when they took her. She's not that little girl anymore." Outside, the town was waking. Wagon wheels groaned. A chapel bell rang out. Whispers spread like prairie fire licking at dry grass. Jedediah stepped onto the porch, and there stood Sheriff Amos, arms crossed, waiting like he'd been expecting him. Amos stood there grayer than Jedediah remembered, but still broad in the shoulders, still steady on his feet. His hat sat low, shadowing eyes that gave away nothing. "News spreads fast," Amos said. "Faster than the wind, it seems." "I'm not here for handshakes," Jedediah replied. "This ain't a reunion." "You brought her back?" Jedediah's voice was flat. "Cold. Found her in a barn. Tied up like a damn animal." Amos's expression darkened. "Where?" "Up by Tanner's Ridge." Name of the man was Jeb. The sheriff let out a slow breath. "That cursed place again." "You knew something," Jedediah pressed. "I had suspicions," Amos admitted. "But there was never anything solid. Just rumors. And back then, no one was willing to dig too deep." Jedediah's eyes sharpened. "Why not?" Amos hesitated. "Because the dirt had names carved into it." Jedediah stepped in close, his tone rough as gravel. "Then give me one." Silence. Then, quietly, Amos said, "About 2 years after Lydia Grace vanished, a man passed through. Wore a red bandana. Smiled too much. Called himself a traitor. Got real friendly with the mayor. And disappeared just as quick. You never thought to tell me?" Jedediah's voice dropped, more edge than sound. "I had no badge where he went. No authority. I filed what I could. Didn't stick." Jedediah took another step. His voice was low, dangerous. "You should have tried harder." Amos nodded once, guilt heavy in the movement. "I know." They stood facing each other. 2 men weathered by loss, one drowning in regret, the other burning with it. A voice rang out from the street. "Hey, that girl, they're saying she's Lydia Grace Tate, the one they said was kidnapped." Jedediah turned toward the noise. A small crowd had formed. Women clutching their shawls, men whispering under their breath. A boy sprinting ahead, wild-eyed. The saloon doors creaked open, and out stepped Judge Laramie. He looked the same, composed, clean-shaven. That silver pocket watch catching the sun like it was more important than anything else. His eyes locked on Jedediah. "Well," Laramie said coolly, "didn't think we'd see you ride into town again, Tate." Didn't plan on it, Jedediah replied. And the girl? She's mine. I'll need proof of that. Jedediah's jaw tightened. She's not a piece of livestock. You don't get to inspect her like one. Laramie's smile was thin. This town runs on law, friend. Amos stepped forward, planting himself between them. Leave it alone, Laramie. The judge raised an eyebrow. You forgetting who signs off on that jail you run? Amos didn't flinch. No. I remember who cuts checks and who keeps people quiet. Laramie's jaw twitched. Careful, Sheriff. Some rocks best left unturned. More people were gathering now. The murmur swelled, sounding like wind rustling through tall grass before a storm. Inside the doctor's office, Lydia Grace stood at the window watching it all. She recognized the faces. Women who used to greet her mother with smiles. Men who once mended fences beside her father. Not one of them spoke. Not one said her name. They just stared, measuring, judging. She turned away, slipped quietly down the hallway, and out the back door. Then she ran, down alleyways, past the chapel, into the woods behind the blacksmith's yard. Her breath came sharp and uneven. Her legs, weak from years of confinement, nearly gave out. But fear lit a fire under her. Jedediah found her 15 minutes later, sitting on the edge of the dry creek bed. Arms folded tight. Mud streaked down her cheeks like war paint and sorrow. I can't stay here, she said, her voice dry and brittle. He knelt beside her. I don't belong, she whispered. Not really. They're looking at me like I'm some ghost. Like I'm the problem for surviving. You didn't break anything, he said. She wiped her face roughly. They wish I'd just stayed gone. Jedediah was quiet for a while. Then he said, there's some folks who feel that way. Because if you stay, if you talk, names get ruined. Reputations burn. I'm not looking for revenge. I am, he said without hesitation. But I'll settle for justice. She looked at him, eyes glinting with something raw. What if the man in the red bandana shows up? Jedediah didn't blink. Then he'll find I'm not the same man he walked over years ago. And you're not the same girl they took. He reached down and helped her up. And together they walked back toward town. The sky behind the church glowing gold with evening light. And this time, when people stared, she stared back, not with shame, but with fire. That night, Lydia Grace entered the chapel. She moved with quiet certainty to the front pew, folded her hands, and spoke a prayer only she could hear. As she turned to go, she paused beside the preacher. You still keep records? Yes, ma'am, he said. Then put my name back where it belongs. Outside, a man watched from atop a horse. A red bandana was tied loose at his throat. His grin twitched as he turned and rode west, vanishing into smoke. The real storm was coming tomorrow, and this time it had a name. The town fell quiet, but silence didn't stop the questions. By morning, the preacher's old ledger held one new line, written just beneath her childhood entry. Lydia Grace Tate returned from presumed death. Some folks whispered it was a miracle. Others called it a disruption. But to Jedediah, it was the first thing in a decade that felt undeniably right. He found her in the quiet stillness of the church's back row, hands moving slowly across the same pew she used to kneel beside as a little girl. Her hands didn't tremble like they had before, but her eyes still carried the heavy hush of someone who'd spent years trying not to make a sound. She came here once, Lydia Grace said softly, not looking up. My baby. Jedediah went rigid, his spine locking tight. I overheard a man speaking, she continued. Said he was dropping her at the church. Said she'd be raised clean, proper. Under the Lord's eye. Like I was filth. Like loving her made me unworthy. When did this happen? He asked, voice low. 8 years back, maybe 7, she replied. It's all a blur. They kept me chained most of the time. I stopped keeping track of days. Jedediah eased down beside her on the bench. You remember anything else? A name? A face? She shook her head slowly. No name. But I remember his boots. Shiny, black as coal. And the sound they made when he walked on stone. Her breath trembled out of her. I prayed every night that she'd forget me, that her life would be safe enough for forgetting to feel like love. Jedediah stared ahead, his eyes fixed on the stained glass window at the altar. Sunlight bled through the colored panes. Red's like blood spilled unjust. Gold's like fire that refused to die out. We can talk to the preacher, he said at last. Ask about the children taken in around that time. You think he'll give you that? No, Jedediah said, standing. But I think Sheriff Amos might get more answers than we would. They left the chapel close to noon. The streets still slick with mud and thick with stairs. At the sheriff's office, Amos stood on the porch, arms crossed like he'd been waiting all morning. Let me guess, he said. You're looking for a child. Not just any child, Jedediah replied. Her child. Amos didn't flinch. He just nodded and stepped inside, reaching for a thick, battered logbook. We don't keep official birth records, he said, but I know someone who might have written it down all the same. He led them around to the back of the jailhouse, where the town's oldest teacher still lived. Miss Prudence, 80 years old if she was a day, sharp as broken glass and twice as cautious. She didn't bother getting up when they arrived, just kept knitting from her rocking chair, eyes like needles. What now, she muttered. We're trying to find a girl, Amos said. Born around 8 years ago. Might have been left at the church. Miss Prudence sniffed sharply. Plenty of lost little ones have passed through this town. You'll have to be more specific than that. Lydia Grace stepped forward, voice quiet but firm. She would have had bright blue eyes, like mine, and a birthmark on her collarbone shaped like a crescent moon. The knitting stopped. Miss Prudence slowly stood, saying nothing, and disappeared into the house. She returned a moment later holding a notebook worn thin with age. The pages yellowed and delicate like brittle leaves. She flipped through with care until her finger landed on one name. Baby girl. No name given. Dropped off by a rancher, Silas Crow. Said he was delivering her for a family out west. Claimed she had no kin. Left her at the chapel. Gone before first light. Silas Crow, Jedediah repeated. He's still around? Miss Prudence shook her head. No. Took his own life 2 winters back. Left behind a note that made no sense. Said I ain't clean. And neither's the land I walk on. Amos took the notebook from her carefully. And the girl? Where is she now? Miss Prudence's eyes drifted to Lydia Grace, then back to the sheriff. She's at the schoolhouse. The preacher and his wife took her in. Call her Willa. Lydia Grace swayed on her feet, the color draining from her face. Jedediah reached out quickly, steadying her by the elbow. I want to see her, she said, breath catching. Hold on, Amos said gently. We need to take this slow. That little girl's known them as her family for nearly 10 years. We can't just show up and tear that apart. Lydia Grace's voice went ice cold. She's mine. No one's arguing that, Jedediah said quietly, stepping between them. But Amos is right. If you want her to trust you, we've got to do this right. Lydia Grace closed her eyes. Tears slid silently down her cheeks. I don't want to frighten her. Then we won't, Jedediah promised. We asked the preacher to send her to the chapel. Just a quiet visit. Nothing more. An hour later, the preacher's wife brought Willa herself in. No urgency in her steps, no questions in her eyes. Lydia Grace waited in the back of the chapel. Fingers wound tight around her shawl. Her breath caught when the door creaked open. The girl was small, no older than 10. Hair the color of wheat. Eyes so blue they could have lit the stained glass from the inside out. She walked down the aisle with easy steps and sat in the front pew, looking around with innocent curiosity. Lydia Grace stayed hidden in the shadows, her feet rooted to the stone floor. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Jedediah stood nearby, arms crossed over his chest, his heart hammering behind his ribs. She favors you, he whispered. No, Lydia Grace said under her breath. She looks better. Willa turned and noticed them. Her gaze landed first on Jedediah, then drifted to Lydia Grace. Are you the lady who asked to see me? She asked politely. Lydia Grace nodded, slow and unsure. Willa tilted her head. Do I know you? The air thickened around them, heavy with something unspoken. I used to know someone, Lydia Grace began. Who had your eyes? Willa blinked. Was she kind? She was scared, Lydia Grace admitted. But she tried. The little girl smiled, faint and thoughtful. I get scared too sometimes. Lydia Grace took one hesitant step forward. Do you ever wonder where you came from? Willa gave a small shrug. Mama says the Lord put me where I'm meant to be. And what do you think? Lydia Grace asked gently. Where do you belong? Willa paused, brow furrowed in thought. I'm not sure, she said softly. Sometimes it feels like I'm unfinished. Like there's something waiting inside me to be remembered. Lydia Grace pressed her hand to her mouth, her breath catching. Willa stood there, uncertain now. Are you all right, miss? She asked gently. Lydia Grace gave a small nod, even though her knees were close to giving out beneath her. If you want, you can go, she said. But Willa didn't move. Instead, she said, I had a dream last night. A woman was crying. She had a scar on her hand. She was holding me close. But I couldn't see her face. That broke something wide open in Lydia Grace. She collapsed to her knees. The shawl slipped from her shoulders. And there it was, faint but clear, the scar across her hand. Willa's eyes widened. They didn't speak. Not right away. Then, with quiet steps, the girl moved forward and wrapped her arms around the woman who'd never stopped looking for her. Across the road from the chapel, the whole town seemed to hold its breath. But in the shadows near a post, a man in a red bandana watched it all. A knife flicked open in his hand. His smile slithered across his face like something poisonous. Then he turned and stepped inside the saloon. Later, the preacher's wife would say he ordered a drink he never touched, just dropped a coin on the counter, and left behind a folded scrap of paper with 5 chilling words. She's not the only one. The saloon's old boards groaned beneath the weight of what they'd always known. The man in the red bandana sat like a man with no fear. His boots up, dagger in hand, running it slowly across a cloth. That blade had heard more screams than the town ever dared admit. He didn't hide, didn't twitch. He knew Jedediah Tate would come. Men like Jedediah always did. But they came bearing hesitation. They came heavy with guilt and slower because of it. That kind of weight dulled a man's edge. He sipped whiskey like he was waiting on a polite knock. Not a father carrying hell between his ribs. Outside, the townsfolk had gathered like thunderclouds before a storm. By morning, word had already spread. Lydia Grace Tate's daughter had been found, and now the man who'd taken everything was sitting calm as you please, drinking across from the general store, like he still had a claim to this place. Sheriff Amos stood at the edge of the boardwalk, his thumb resting near his belt, the other hand hovering over the grip of his Colt. He didn't know what chapter of the law covered selling children. There wasn't one. There was just rage in the gut, and the burn of ash in the throat. Jedediah came down the road slow and sure. His boots were heavy with mud from the chapel, the woods, and the roads he'd ridden for 10 years, refusing to stop. Lydia Grace walked beside him now, shoulders squared, no longer in hiding. She wore her scars openly, not like shame, but like truth. And Willa followed close behind, a ribbon in her hair, her small hand wrapped around her grandfather's. They didn't speak. As they passed familiar faces, the smithy, the preacher's house, the same people who once chose silence over courage. But when they reached the saloon, Jedediah stepped up onto the porch and opened the door like a man opening a coffin. Inside, the red bandana looked up, that smug grin already curling on his face. Well, he said, voice thick with mockery, ain't this a sweet little picture? But Lydia Grace didn't wait. She walked in like the room was hers by right. Every step spoke louder than words, and the years he'd stolen only sharpened what was left of her. I remember your hands, she said coldly. They reeked of smoke and turpentine. I remember your voice in the dark. And I remember praying for you to die. The man gave a low laugh, slow, bitter, cruel. You remember wrong. I kept you fed, gave you a roof. You chained me to a bed. I bought you. And now you owe me. Jedediah's hand hovered near his revolver. But he waited. The man stood slowly, arms wide, inviting the town to witness his show. You really gonna kill me here, Tate? Right in front of everyone? This ain't justice. This is just revenge. Maybe it is, Jedediah replied. But sometimes those two wear the same face. That's when Sheriff Amos stepped forward. You've got two options, he said. You come with me quiet, or they'll carry what's left of you. The man glanced toward the windows. The town was watching. He made a fatal mistake. He reached. Jedediah's revolver barked once. The man's hand snapped back, knife clattering to the floor. Then Amos lunged and hauled him outside. Blood trailing behind like a curse uncoiling. No one clapped. No one cried. Justice doesn't always ask for applause. Inside the saloon, Lydia Grace sat at the piano bench. Willa climbed into her lap. The whole room finally let out a breath. Later that evening, in the sheriff's office, the man refused to talk, refused to name the others. But they found what he wouldn't say. A ledger in his saddlebag. Folded. Detailed. Horrific. Names. Dates. Trades. Dozens of them. Some still missing. Some never to be found. Jedediah stood over the list, reading each name aloud, voice calm, though every word carved new wounds into his chest. We open every grave, he said. We dig until the silence breaks. The weeks that followed were heavy, not just with grief, but with something deeper, purpose. Lydia Grace stayed in Dry Fork, not because it welcomed her, but because it was the first place she'd ever reclaimed her voice. She helped others speak, helped men face what they'd ignored. Willa stayed too. She grew brighter, sang in the chapel, laughed beside the preacher's wife. She called Lydia Grace Ma before summer gave way to autumn. And Jedediah? He rebuilt the barn where they'd found her, not to hold animals, but to build a school, a place where no voice would be stolen again. One golden evening, as dusk spilled across the hills, Jedediah sat on the front porch of the schoolhouse, watching Willa dance in circles, chasing fireflies. Lydia Grace stood beside him, arms folded, a quiet smile on her lips. She still thinks they're stars, she said. She gets that from you. She gets more than that. He looked at her, his voice rough. You saved her. By surviving. She turned toward him, her eyes gentler now. You came for me. He looked back, his eyes dammed. I never stopped. They sat together as the sky dimmed. Then she asked, what do you do? When the world finally says you matter, you make sure it never forgets. And if you're hearing this, wherever you are, take this to heart. Some men bury their shame. Others carry it like weight they can't put down. But a few? They fight. They ride through storms, through mud, through silence so thick it almost wins. And they do it for love. Because sometimes, the only reason a daughter is found is because her father refused to stop looking. And sometimes, that's the ground where dignity stands tallest.